Thank you so much to the Harvard Center here in Tunis for this wonderful opportunity, and thank you especially to CIHEM for organizing this talk with such graceful efficiency. And thank you to all of you guys for being here. During the last 20 years or so, understandings of the history of Islamic philosophy and theology, especially in their later centuries, have been undergoing dramatic changes. So far, however, the vast majority of the research has focused on historical trends in the Middle East and in Persia, with much less attention paid to North Africa and especially to the Maghrib. So what I'm going to try to do here today is to kind of bring this conversation to the Maghrib and to look closely at just one aspect of the writings of one particularly important Maghribi thinker to start thinking through what it might look like to incorporate this region into this, this narrative that's still undergoing changes and still emerging. And so in order to do this, we will begin with a very brief kind of generalized overview of what the previous predominant narrative was, the previous view about the history of Islamic philosophy and theology. Then we'll look at what this new narrative that's emerging is. Then we'll turn to this one particular thinker, Muhammad bin Yusuf al-Sanusi. We'll explain why we're looking at him, why we're interested in him specifically, who he was, and then zoom in for a close analysis of, like I said, just one aspect of his writings, and that's going to be the way in which he formatted his theological writings and what this can tell us about his theological project. And then finally, a kind of quick wrap up and thinking through what some of the implications of this analysis might be. So to begin with, when I say Islamic philosophy and theology, what does that mean? What those terms are referring to in Arabic are the intellectual traditions called falsafa and kalam. Both of these emerged, again, this is very general terms, both of these emerged kind of around the 8th, 9th century in Baghdad. Falsafa emerges in the context of a vast translation movement of Greek texts, especially Greek philosophical texts. So we're talking Aristotle and Plato, a translation of these texts from the Greek into the Arabic, which then results in this intellectual tradition called falsafa. Kalam, again, very broadly speaking, was a more indigenous form of Islamic theology, but one that was very much animated by the belief that people do not innately or naturally know even foundational Islamic doctrine, like that God exists, that God is all-powerful, that God is all-knowing. People do not innately know this, but rather it's the job of theologians to develop compelling, logical, demonstrative proofs that will demonstrate the verity of these points of doctrine and then to teach them to people. So according to the understanding of the history of these disciplines that was predominant in the 20th century, and I'm going to call it the older narrative, but the truth is it's actually still a very prevalent narrative today. I was just talking with someone here in Tunis earlier this week who told me, oh, you work on the later centuries, nothing happened in those centuries, why would you look at them? So this older narrative is very much one of a golden age followed by decline or stagnation. So according to this understanding, kind of as soon as falsafa and kalam emerged, they experienced this golden period of flourishing and creativity and vitality, which came to an end with the death of the Andalusi philosopher Ibn Rushd, or Averroes. He died in 1198, and the idea, according to this earlier view, was that at that time the torch of philosophy or reason was handed off to Europe, which experienced its Renaissance and its Enlightenment. And in the meantime, what happens in the Islamic world supposedly is that falsafa disappeared and that kalam stagnated or declined. And to give us a concrete look at what this older narrative looked like in action, I want to take a very quick look at the table of contents of a survey text This is by a leading 20th century Orientalist, W. Montgomery Watt. This text, which is supposed to be a comprehensive history of Islamic philosophy and theology, was first published in 1962, republished in 1985, and still one of the only survey texts that exists in the field. So we don't need to worry about all the details here, but what I want to call attention to is that the vast majority of this overview deals with the formative or the classical period, so kind of pre-Averroes. And if you look here, it goes all the way up. It's the first 133 pages, all the way up to here, are devoted to that time. And he has only 20 pages for the years, the centuries from 1250 to 1850. And if we zoom in on that, he's labeled this chapter the stagnation of philosophical theology. So this is really pretty typical of what this older narrative looked like. There's so much more of interest and so much more happening in this earlier period, and then not much going on. And what generally is meant by stagnation, what that is pointing to is the supposed rise of more conservative scholars during these centuries who were antagonistic toward supposedly rational engagement with Islamic doctrine. Stagnation meant that there was no new or original work happening, that scholars from this time period were merely writing commentaries on the treatises of earlier authors, and surely these commentaries were only regurgitation or repetition of earlier ideas. Because of the assumption of decline, there has not been much research done into these later centuries. They've been taken as just kind of not worthy of much attention. And this is what's been changing in the last 20 years or so. And with the new research that's happening into the later centuries, we are getting a new narrative, a new view of what the history of Falsafa and Kalam looked like. So instead of positing that Falsafa disappeared and Kalam stagnated, this new view posits that the two disciplines became mixed together or blended together, and that this happened around the 11th, 12th, 13th centuries. And what this means specifically is that technical terms from Falsafa, concepts, techniques that were used in Falsafa, examples, were taken from that and absorbed or appropriated into Kalam. And this was especially true of logic, which was a part of Falsafa, so the use of syllogisms and whatever else was brought into Kalam, but also a lot of other features of Falsafa. And this mixing, this blending occurred to such a degree that one of the leading historians in this field, who works at McGill University in Montreal, has written that my ultimate conclusion has been that while mutakallimun, or people who practiced kalam, and falasifa, or people who practiced falsafa, while they often presented their respective projects as being categorically dissimilar, the two strands of thought were so intertwined at the conceptual level that it is almost impossible to disentangle them without ripping apart the intricate tapestry of Islamic intellectual history. And in fact, this observation had already been made by Ibn Khaldun of Tunis in the early part of the 1400s. So we're kind of coming back to this view many centuries later. And to get even more specific about this, when and how did the blending take place? According to this new narrative, this process is rooted in the works of perhaps the most brilliant thinker in the Falsafa tradition, Abu Ali ibn Sina, or Avicenna. He dies in 1037, and very shortly after his death, we already have a major theologian, Abu Ma'ali al-Juwayni, reading Avicenna's texts, engaging with the ideas, taking some of those ideas, some of those concepts, some of those terms, and absorbing them into his writings and kalam. And this process is continued by his student, Abu Hamid al-Ghazali, this process of confronting falsafa, appropriating aspects of it. And then according to this new view, the blending becomes fully fledged with the writings of Fakhruddin al-Razi, who dies in 1210. And this full-fledged blending, what we might call Razian style of kalam, or a fully falsafaized kalam, is carried on through the centuries. And so here's a list of just some of the names that historians today have been looking into and recovering as having worked in this kind of new style of kalam. And you may or may not be able to tell from the names, but most of them are from Persia, from the Middle East. Like I said at the outset, there's been less work done so far on North Africa, on the Maghrib. And like I said, what we're going to try to do here is to start folding in at least one person and seeing how he fits or doesn't fit. And that is Muhammad bin Yusuf al-Sanusi. He dies in 1490, so that would put him kind of right in the middle there. And so far, people are starting to take some notice of Sanusi, realizing his works were quite influential, kind of a big deal. Maybe we should figure out where he fits. And there's been some tentative suggestions that he does in fact fit into this narrative. People kind of glanced at his text and said, he's using a lot of logic. He's really a big fan of syllogisms. It seems like he is part of this trend. However, there's at least one scholar from Algeria, Jamaluddin Boukli, and one scholar from Morocco, Said Bouskilawi, who have suggested that in fact Sanusi had a much more wary or even antagonistic attitude toward this style of kalam. And in my own readings of Sanusi, I agree with them, and what I'm going to do here is present one aspect of Sanusi's writings that they haven't looked at, but that I think support this kind of need to tell a different story about what Sanusi was doing. But before getting into all those details, why should we look at Sanusi and who was he? So although Sanusi has kind of dropped out of scholarly interest in the course of the 20th century, and I'd be happy to talk about maybe why that is later, it would really be hard to overstate how influential his writings were from, say, the 16th, 17th century up into the early 20th century. So he was originally from Algeria, but his writings, his theological writings, and especially his Aqidah Sukhra, or the Short Creed, which was also called al-Barahin, or the Mother of Proofs, became a staple of the theological curriculum at Al-Azhar in Cairo, which was, at the time was becoming the preeminent center of Sunni learning in the Islamic world. In addition, this same scholar, Robert Wisnowski from McGill, has counted so far over 140 commentaries and glosses that were written on the Short Creed alone, which is really a staggering number. In addition, the text, the Short Creed, was translated into a number of languages, including Spanish in the 16th century, Teshilhit, Fulfulde, which is a West African language, Malay, and Javanese, and indeed it became the key theological text in the Malay archipelago, which of course is all the way down there, and likely from there it traveled to South Africa, where it was a key part of the curriculum in Islamic schools in South Africa. So it really has a wide dispersal. And speaking briefly from my own experience this year in the manuscript libraries around Morocco, Algeria, and now Tunisia, it's so evident from the theological sections of these manuscript catalogs how dominant Sanusi's writings were. When you look through the catalogs, there's just so many copies of his own texts as well as commentaries on his texts. And this is not to say that these were the only theological writings in the catalogs or that were written at the time, and I certainly don't want to suggest that if we understand Sanusi's writings, we'll have a comprehensive or an exhaustive understanding of the theological trends in the areas where he was influential. But I do think that this influence makes him a compelling starting point as we start to bring the Maghrib or North Africa into this historiographical conversation. So who was this person who was so influential? His full name was Muhammad bin Yusuf al-Sanusi. He likely was born in 839 in the Hijri calendar or 1435 on the Christian calendar. He died in 895 or 1490. He was born in Tlemcen, he died in Tlemcen, he spent most of his life there. This is a city that's now in western Algeria, close to the border with Morocco. At the time, it was the capital of the Zayanid dynasty, whose neighbors and rivals were the Meriniyin, the Marinids in Fez, and the Hafsids, had their capital here in Tunis. And Tlemcen at the time really seems to have been a center of learning and of scholarship. And so Sanusi had a variety of teachers, some of them local, living in Tlemcen, some of them visiting who were drawn to the city for one reason or another. And Sanusi was able to study a variety of fields or disciplines with them, and he wrote texts in a number of areas, including logic. He wrote a number of texts in logic, was very interested in that field. He wrote in tafsir, he wrote in hadith, he wrote in medicine, in Sufism. He has a text on the use of the astrolabe in astronomy. But his main field of interest was kalam, and that's where he wrote most of his texts. And within the area of kalam, he wrote several commentaries on works by other authors, but he also wrote 5 of his own standalone treatises, and then he wrote commentaries on these. And the interesting thing here is that they really represent kind of a hierarchy. They're directed at different levels of audiences, which I'm also happy to talk about later. So the longest and most complex one is called al-Aqidah al-Kubra, or the Long Creed. It's really for advanced scholars and students. Then we have al-Aqidah al-Wusta, or the Middle Creed, also for advanced scholars and students, but kind of more streamlined and abbreviated. Then we have the text that becomes so influential, al-Aqidah al-Sukhra, the Short Creed, which is explicitly for people at the outset of a scholarly career. Then you have the Aqidah Sukhra, what I'm calling the Concise Creed, which is for a less academically trained audience. And then a text called Sukhra, also known as al-Hafida, al-Aqidah al-Hafida, or the granddaughter, which I think is a play on, like, you have the mother of proofs, and then 2 generations later, the granddaughter, which is this short creed that he did not write a commentary on, but later commentators seem to think it's meant for women, children, and the weak in memorization. Thank you, Sanusi. And these texts are going to be what I'm focusing on here, because I take them to be the clearest expression of his pedagogical and theological project. This is the place where he's able to kind of most clearly say, this is what I think kalam is. And all of these texts were written in the Ash'ari school of kalam, which by the time Sanusi was writing in the 15th century was the predominant school. But we need to be careful not to confuse its predominance with its homogeneity. So just because it was the predominant school doesn't mean that everything looked the same. And I particularly want to call attention to 2 main trends that were present within Ash'arism in the centuries leading up to Sanusi. So one of these was grounded in a text by Juwayni, and if we recall, he was the first theologian back in Persia to really start engaging with Avicenna's writings. And his text, The Guide, or Al-Irshad, became quite popular, especially in the Islamic West, in Al-Andalus and in the Maghrib. There were a number of commentaries written on it. It also inspired a kind of abbreviated version of it called Al-Aqidah al-Burhaniyya by a scholar in Fez. And this text, in turn, attracted a number of commentaries, so you really kind of have a legacy built on this Juwaynian text. And Maghribi scholars as well were engaging with this Razian style of kalam, so the more falsified, more fully falsified form of kalam. And perhaps the clearest example of this, or the best known, is a text called Al-Mukhtasar al-Shamil. It's by the scholar Ibn Arafa, also of Tunis. He dies in 1401. And he explicitly was basing this on a text called Tawala al-Anwar by Baydawi, who was explicitly writing in the Razian tradition. So this trend is also very much present in the Maghrib and known to Sanusi when he was writing. And so we don't need to worry too much about the details, but the main point I'm trying to make here is that Sanusi was making active decisions, right? When he sat down to write his theological material, he had a range of kind of models and options in front of him, and he was deciding what he thought kalam should be, what it should look like. So what did those decisions look like? A brief reminder that some historians working today have suggested that he fits with this Razian tradition, with this Razian style, more falsified. And like I said, he definitely did use logic very systematically. But as at least two other scholars have suggested, it seems like there's reason to think, in fact, he was wary of or even kind of hostile toward this style. And I think the clearest place we can see this is in a quote from the introduction of the Short Creed, where he says, "Let the beginner be wary of efforts on his part to draw his principles of religion, usul dinihi, from books that are stuffed with the discourse of the philosophers, books whose authors are intent on disseminating their foolishness and those of their views that are patent unbelief, the impurity of which they hide through those of their specialized terms and expressions that are obscure to most people, the majority of which are in fact meaningless words. Examples are the works of al-Imam al-Fakhr and the Tawala of Baydawi and those who followed their model." And it's kind of a dig here. Al-Imam al-Fakhr is Fakhruddin al-Razi. So it's clear that, at least for beginning students, Sanusi did not see much usefulness in theological texts written in the style of Razi, and in fact, he saw potential danger and harm there. He worried that they were going to be, perhaps confusing, they're unnecessarily complicated. And so what I want to look at now is one particular way in which Sanusi distance his writing. So he kind of has this rhetorical flourish at the beginning, but how did he actually distance his own writings from this Razian style? And what we're going to look at is how he formatted or structured his theological treatises. So all five, kind of remarkably given what a range of audience he was writing for, all five of those treatises, the creeds that I mentioned, had the same format. So they began with a statement about the need for all Muslims to know at least basic logical proofs regarding the nature of God and prophets. And then Sanusi would lay out this three-part typology of things that we know, or kind of a three-part division of rational judgments. And so the idea is that when the mind is faced with a concept and we need to make a rational judgment about it, we judge it either to be wajib, or necessary, so we judge it to be something whose non-existence is inconceivable, or we judge it to be mustahil, that is, its existence would be inconceivable, or we judge it to be jaiz, contingent or possible, which means that either its existence or its non-existence is conceivable to us. And this three-part typology is really central to how he approaches and frames what kalam in general is. And so he says in the middle creed, one must know first that a rational judgment, so this is al-hukm al-aqli, is limited to three divisions: necessity, impossibility, and possibility. All the investigations of the science of kalam turn on the pivot of these three. And what he means by that in practice, and the way that he formats his creeds, is that after this introduction, he turns to the nature of God, and he addresses what's necessary to uphold with regard to God. So it's necessary, we can only conceive of the existence of God. Have some water. It's necessary that God is all-knowing, that God is all-powerful. It's impossible that God is impotent, or that God is ignorant. And then Sanusi addresses what's possible. And then he does the same for prophets. Says what's necessary to uphold with regard to prophets, what's impossible, and what's possible. Now, this division did not originate with Sanusi. It actually has quite a long history. And according to, again, Robert Wisnowski, who's this historian at McGill, it actually comes from, first into the Islamic tradition, it comes from Avicenna, who had taken it in turn from the Aristotelian tradition, this idea that you can divide rational judgments into three parts. And because the division is Avicennian, and because Sanusi was writing after Razi in the 15th century, some people who haven't studied Sanusi's writings too much have kind of thought, This is Avicennian. Sanusi was writing in the 15th century. He's in the later group of scholars. Clearly, this means that he's writing in the Razian style, that he's participating in falsified kalam. However, if we look back more closely at the history of the usage of this categorization of judgments, we find that it actually already appeared in the writings of Juwayni, who, if you remember, was the first theologian to engage with Avicenna. So Juwayni, in the text The Guide, which became so important in the Islamic West, already there he wrote, "When the rational person has thoroughly grasped the createdness of the world and come to see that it has a creator, then the next duty for him after that is to reflect on three principles. One of them consists in the designation of what among the attributes is incumbent or necessary on God Most High. The second comprises the designation of what is impossible for him, and the third consists of designating what of his rulings is possible. Upon statement of these principles, the bases of doctrinal points will be concluded, God willing." So again, it's this framing of you can encompass all of kalam and what a theologian's task is. You can encompass it in these three principles, as he calls them. And we have a list here of influential thinkers in the Islamic West who took up this division. It appears in their own writings. So, for example, Ibn Rushd al-Jad, who is the head judge in Cordoba and the grandfather of the philosopher Averroes, in a fatwa about the Asharis, he wrote, "The Asharis are, by their knowledge of the principles of creeds, diyanet, the scholars of truth, due to their knowledge of God, glorified and sublime be He, and what is necessary for Him, what is possible for Him, and what is denied of Him." And we find the same division in the writings of the founder of the Almohad movement, Ibn Tumart. We find the same in the writings of another influential theologian, Ibn al-Arabi. This is not the Sufi Ibn Arabi, this is a different Ibn al-Arabi, who studied with Ghazali in the East and then returned to Sevilla and became a judge there. And he wrote, "Theology comprises three divisions: a division regarding what is necessary for the Creator Most High, a division on what is possible for Him, and a division on what is impossible for Him." And we find similar statements in these remaining authors. So I think, or I would suggest, what we're seeing here is that Sanusi was building on a long-standing tradition in the Islamic West. And it really doesn't make sense to read his use of this three-part division as particularly Razian. It's perhaps grounded in Avicenna's ideas, but it does not seem to be flowing through that same trajectory of Avicenna to Juwayni to Ghazali to Razi. And in fact, when we compare Sanusi's formatting with the typical formatting of Razian texts, we find that they're very different. And here I'm drawing on the work of a current historian, Heidrun Eichner, who has determined that there was one particular format, and this is very evident if you look at texts, that became really popular, that first crystallized in Razi's text, al-Mulakhis fil Hikmah, or the abridged work in philosophy. It was then picked up by scholars like Nasiruddin al-Tusi, Nasiruddin al-Baydawi, Abduluddin al-Iji, Sa'aduddin al-Taftazani. It really becomes kind of the predominant format for text written in this style. And this format consists of, first, a section on epistemology, some discussion of logic, then a section called al-Umur al-Amma, looking at qualities shared by contingent and uncreated entities. So it's this whole discussion of concepts like the nature of existence, the nature of essence, what is unity, what is multiplicity, what is necessity, what is contingency, etc. And then you have a third section focused just on contingent entities and their division into jawahir wa arad, or substances and accidents. And again, dealing with topics like what is the body, what is the soul, what is intellect, or what are features of accidents like quality and quantity and other Aristotelian categories. And only then does the author arrive at al-ilahiyat, which is dealing with God, divine matters, and finally an-nubuwat, or dealing with prophets or prophetic matters. And it should be pretty clear that this is quite different from what Sanusi was doing. So he does not have any of these first three sections, but rather the entirety of his treatises are focused on al-ilahiyat and al-nubuwat, so divine matters and prophetic matters. And this is not to say that Sanusi didn't know the material of these earlier sections in the other texts. And to give just one example, in several of Sanusi's treatises, he cites and engages with Baydawi, so he was a typical Razian author. He engages with Baydawi's definition of oneness, or wahda, but he does it in the section on divine matters. He wants to talk about wahda because he wants to talk about the wahdaniya, the oneness of God. And so this turns up in divine matters for him, whereas in Baydawi's text, it had been in common things. It had been he was interested in it just to talk about wahda, whereas for Sanusi, he's interested in wahda to talk about the nature of God. And so what I would suggest is going on with this formatting is that it really kind of streamlines the material that Sanusi is including. It almost acts like a filter for what is relevant, what belongs in kalam, and what does not belong in kalam. And it seems pretty clear that for him, what is properly kalam is what is limited to this framework of necessity, possibility with regard to God and prophets that really is coming out of a tradition of engaging with Juwayni and this long tradition in the Islamic West. So to wrap up here, and to briefly review again one final time this new narrative that has been emerging in the last 10, 20 years among historians is that in its later centuries, falsafa and kalam came to be mixed together. This happened through kind of a pretty quick process of greater and greater disciplinary blending. It's kind of rooted with the writings of Avicenna. First steps are taken with Juwayni. There's greater confrontation and appropriation with Ghazali, and then you get this full-fledged blending with Fakhruddin al-Razi that's carried on for centuries. And historians who put forward this narrative are really careful to not claim that this is a linear narrative, that it so clearly happened in this way, or that it's exclusive, that theology couldn't take any other forms. However, a lot of research so far has kind of confirmed and fit with this general trajectory. And what we get with Sanusi is a concrete example of a very influential later person writing in these later centuries who breaks with the expectations set by this narrative. And I think in particular, his writings point to a need for caution in periodizing this trajectory. So in particular, in considering that Juwayni was just a first step in this kind of larger process of kalam becoming more and more falsified. And what I would suggest is that rather than viewing Juwayni as simply a first step, at least when we're looking at the Islamic West, I think it would be quite helpful to consider that he might stand at the basis of a theological tradition that continued to exert authority into the post-classical period. Thank you for listening. Thanks, guys. I know it's a lot to absorb.
Thank you for this presentation. It's really very important to bring life this kind of text because it's still unknown for the scholars, and I think it's very important to bring new perspectives about the history of thoughts in the Islamic history. I have some few questions.
Great.
And Muhammad ibn Yusuf, do you have any connection with the Sunusi order?
Not really. I mean, the interesting thing is, right, he was so influential, and today he's so forgotten that I've often had the experience of telling someone I work on Sanusi and they confuse him with a different Sanusi, the one in Libya or the Sufi order.
And I have another question. Before that, it's very amazing this kind of the long creed, and I think it's very unique. I think because scholars they want to in his text to not talk to everyone for the scholars also for the awam, because when you see it, and I think it's unique. I didn't see it before for the other scholars in the Orient or in the Maghrib. This kind of classification and this kind of discourse in his right. But did you have any idea about the circulation of his text? You know, hadith and so on. It's circulated in the scholastic phenomena in the Orient or in the madrasas. But normally in the madrasa we cannot find the education of philosophy. How this text was circulated, and
So I actually, a couple things. I think the degree to which he was explicitly writing for such different audiences, and the degree to which he did that was maybe unique, but it was pretty common for people, like Averroes, for example, had his long commentary on Aristotle, his middle commentary on Aristotle, and his short. They were mostly all for scholars, but it wasn't unusual, and especially in theology, for scholars to write a longer version and then shorter, more accessible versions. I think writing 5 levels is wildly interesting, but it was not totally unheard of to write kind of stair steps like that. I actually think it's a misconception that philosophy was not, that kalam certainly was taught in madrasas. Like I said, his writings were staples. They were foundational texts at Al-Azhar, for example, for centuries. So I think they had a very wide circulation in kind of all spheres of education.
Do we know where he studied and to which cities, if he traveled somewhere, and
Yeah, it's such a great question. Like I said, he seemed to have traveled very little. He went to a couple neighboring cities for a couple months, but he never went on the Hajj, for example. He really did not venture much outside of his sphere, and I think it seems like it says something about how vibrant the intellectual atmosphere was in Tlemcen at the time that he was able to have access to such a high level of education. But yeah, he himself did not move very much. Yeah.
but still he wrote these treatises on an astrolabe, you said, on astronomy, things like that. So is there a kind of Renaissance? Renaissance influence, or?
I don't think so. I think part of what this rethinking of decline involves is just, I think, opening our minds to there having been an ongoing tradition of scholarship during these centuries. And I should say, this work is very much at the outset. And some people have been quick to have an interest in Europe, or quick to say, was there an Islamic Enlightenment or an Islamic Renaissance? And I think we're so much just trying to figure out who were the key names, what were the key texts, and we're not ready. We know there's a questioning of the decline narrative, but there's certainly nothing to replace it with yet. And it'll take a lot more, I think, very detailed studies before we can do that.
It seems like when you say that the intertwining of falsafa and kalam is a trend that we can maybe recognize in this later period, the way you compared al-Sanusi with al-Razi, and it seemed almost like he was limiting the scope of the things that epistemology could serve. In, you know, it's only divine nature, prophetic nature, which to me kind of makes sense as to why maybe this period is sort of seen as overlooked if there's no sense of like maybe broader use value or application to other disciplines. Like if it's starting to get sort of corralled into this very specific form of intellectual production. Does that make sense?
It does make sense, and in fact, I'm forgetting who this is, but that is one. So as people are kind of trying to figure out what was going on in these later centuries, I think this is precisely what one person has said, is that the rational sciences succeeded so much that they were incorporated so fully into the Islamic tradition that it perhaps did end up kind of limiting the scope in some way. Other people, I think, have pushed back on that narrative. Certainly Razi's texts and whatnot were so, like, that style was so dominant in other regions besides North Africa that it's definitely hard. I don't think we should be making geographic kind of pan-Islam generalizations, but certainly that, I mean, I think that's an idea that's been floated and that people will continue to explore and think about.
And one other very question for someone who doesn't know this at all.
Please.
That can we say that falsafa and when you're focusing on falsafa and kalam, is this can we say that this is the height of intellectual production in this time period in the areas that you're covering, or are you specifically looking at it through the lens of Islamic intellectual production? Are there other forms that
Like what else is going on intellectually at the time? Yeah, that's a great question. These are the main disciplines that are interested in metaphysics, so kind of the big conceptual abstract questions. But there's super interesting stuff going on in fiqh, in jurisprudence. There's super interesting stuff going on in astronomy, and medicine. So yeah, definitely there are many other areas, and you can see that even in Sanusi's own writings. I think there's a lot of continual debates and changes happening in logic, for example. Is that the question?
Yes, that's really interesting. But sorry, it prompts one more question, which is that were those seen as more divided disciplinarily than they had been in an earlier period? Is it in the sense that, like, maybe we could say the Greek tradition at the very beginning of its introduction into Islamic thought was maybe more of a like that sort of Renaissance man type of what science was, and then in this period, are you saying that maybe people were a bit more specialized than a few hundred years before that?
I think not. Okay. That's a great question. So two things in response. One is that some scholars, I mean, of Sonia Brunch's work in particular, have pointed out it wasn't just falsafa and kalam that became blended. There was actually a number of other areas that also did. So logic gets picked up into fiqh. I think falsafa, I mean, kind of infuses a lot of different disciplines. Astronomy, very clearly, timekeeping. So there's really, I think, a lot of cross-pollination that happens around the same time. And again, I mean, Sanusi himself was writing in a whole bunch of different disciplines. So I think, right, I think we're quick to categorize people as he was a theologian, he was a jurist, he was a hadith scholar, but in fact it was very common for people to write. They might have kind of a favorite field, but these were all really intertwined, and I think you can also see very clearly that ideas that someone might have in kalam will turn up, and if it's relevant, might turn up in another area as well.
Thank you.
Yeah.
So I have a few questions. But my first question is about memorization. So you mentioned the series of creeds that Sanusi had written, and the concise creed, or the granddaughter creed, was for those weak in memorization. So I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about the role of text, of manuscripts, but also the role of memorization, and then also thinking about memorization alongside kind of reason, or the power of reason, as ways for people to ensure that they were staying on the right path.
Right, I think it's clear there's textual evidence that certainly not everyone was going to be sitting down and reading these texts, that you might engage with a theological treatise through memorizing it or listening to a sheikh teach it. And there's actually a passage in Sanusi's biography by his disciple where he's like, oh my gosh, my teacher Sanusi, he was so patient with the general populace. He would let anyone who wanted come to his teaching sessions, and they could ask the dumbest questions, and he would always be so kind to them and so patient in response. And so we can kind of gather from that, we can take that at face value. It seems like these sessions were open to a variety of people. There would have been a variety of ways, I think, in which even illiterate folks would have come into contact with this. And then part of Sanusi's legacy, in fact, and this is what my dissertation is related to, part of his legacy in the Islamic West was that people became very concerned with all Muslims knowing basic logical proofs. And it seems like some people at least would go out into the countryside and attempt to make sure that everyone had this logical grounding. And I think your second question was then about kind of use, like the functioning of reason and logic in relation to that.
You just answered it.
Okay.
I think you just answered it. Can I ask you? Oh, sorry,
Yeah, I mean, just to jump in there quickly. Right, I think we hear reason and rationality today, and we're thinking like, oh, like free inquiry. They're encouraging everyone to have their own critical approach. And that's not what we're seeing. The idea was theologians would develop the proofs, and then the general populace would learn them and memorize them. So when we talk about the need for people to engage rationally with doctrine, it's not go out and think for yourselves and figure it out. It's here's your proof for why God exists. Mm-hmm. Now you have sound belief. Yeah.
So can I ask you two questions about Aqidah? So my first one is just like a really general question. Can you talk about the place of Aqidah in the full world of a proper Muslim? So we have, like Father was mentioning, we have divine matters, prophetic matters in this particular creed that Sanusi has written. But I'm also wondering, like, what else were people concerned about, especially for the general population? Like, what else was important to ensure that people who maybe weren't able to, like you were saying before, sit and read or contemplate or create these rational proofs, that they had access to? And then my other question is, this is in relation to contemporary anthropological debates about faith. So I'm going to try to ask the question properly, but you can also maybe tweak it for me. So I'm wondering if what Aqidah, which is frequently translated as faith, right? As creed. Iman, belief. Belief or faith. Okay. So what people are concerned about here, is it what, so these creeds are supposed to support some type of faith or belief, and is this faith or belief interior assent to a set of propositions, right? Like, these things are known about God. This is a powerful logical way of demonstrating to me that I have to assent to these truths about God, which some scholars have called a Protestant understanding of faith or belief. Or is it more about, is this more about ensuring a proper everyday performance of acts? So acts every day in people's relationships with one another that are consistently Muslim. So I'm wondering if you can answer that.
Yeah. it's intriguing the way you framed it. So on the one hand, I mean, the way you laid out assent to a set of propositions, that's actually very close to the Arabic that's used when people talk about what belief is. They use the word assent, it's tasdiq. That's the definition of iman, is that you are assenting to these propositions. It's funny that that is understood as the Protestant conception of belief, because I actually often think that Protestant conceptions get in the way of understanding what's going on here. So these scholars that I look at are very concerned with certainty and the idea that you can use these logical proofs to arrive at unshakable, like the goal is to have no doubts, to know for sure that this is the truth. And I'm not a scholar of Christianity at all, but my kind of general conception of Protestantism is also that there's a lot of, you're making a leap of faith, right? There's always going to be some doubt, but that's kind of embraced as part of what faith is. And that's very much not part of the discourse. You're like, you want to get rid of doubts. You don't want to have any doubts. So it definitely is an assent. It's also definitely framed as, and this maybe goes then to your first question about what was the concern, right, with the general populace? What were they wanting them to do? That was generally what you're getting at. So often these concerns about people's assent or their belief is placed alongside other basic expectations, like that you're praying properly or that you're fasting, and it's considered as foundational as those acts. So I think there is also some sense in which this is, if not an external speech act, then sort of an internal speech act. Like you could probably frame it as being an act in some fashion, but it is also an assent, a mental assent. Right, and there's some great texts. I mean, people, right, we're definitely concerned that the general populace had proper conceptions of these things, and there's one or two fun texts that actually are a record of all the wrong things that people say in the marketplace, where they're like, oh my gosh, I overheard people saying, like, God willing, like, oh yeah, if his God lets him do it, like this idea of like, there's the kind of multiple layers there. So people were really, concerned that every Muslim know, God is one. What does it mean that God is one? That they really have these conceptions in line.
Were these already called fatwas, or did you
Were these?
Yeah, for example, if I'm so in the texts of Sanusi, when you find these, am I praying properly and am I fasting properly, and were these already called fatwas, or is the word newer? This out of curiosity.
No, it's not a new word. Usually the content of belief doesn't turn up in fatawa, but there are some fatawa about like how should you engage with the general populace. Like if you find that people don't know things properly. So it does, and this is an example of theological issues bleeding into legal issues, right? It's not, they'll turn up in both, discussions of this will turn up in both areas. Did you?
Yeah.
Just about this kind of discourse with the population or with the common. Why I said it's I think it's unique because when you see, at least in the Middle East, most scholars like Ibn Taymiyyah, like Ibn Qayyim al-Jawziyya and other, they forbidden to the population to talk about the Aqidah, to talk about, and it's very interesting. If he wrote text with some kind of what can I say, simply discourse for the population, so it's a big question for the intellectual milieu, or it's a question for the common, and it's we have to dig on this yes, on this point, because what was the debates in Tlemcen in this?
This is my dissertation topic, in fact, is exactly looking at what did the general populace need to know? How did the ulama debate this subject? Because some people following Sanusi said, everyone needs to know a basic proof. And other scholars said, don't teach the general populace logic. Don't expose them to this complex theological material. You're going to make them confused. It's going to become much worse. Just leave them be. And so, I mean, it really became quite a heated debate, especially in the Islamic West, from Sanusi onward. It's exactly my dissertation topic. And it's interesting to hear that it was perhaps not as much under discussion in the Middle East. I think I do have the sense that it was kind of particularly a hot issue in the Maghrib. Thank you.
So just in one of the quotes that we saw from Sanusi, he says, so he's kind of rejecting he says the falasifa have dangerous ideas. And so I'm wondering, one, what was he rejecting? Two, if you know, also what philosophers is he talking about? Were there potentially philosophers of some trend of philosophy that perhaps continued on and was not also absorbed into this kind of mishmash of philosophized kalam, or such, just like you're saying, perhaps Sanusi is representing a different type of lineage. So I'm wondering what philosophers he's talking about also, or is he just talking about the ones that predated Ibn Sina, for example?
Yeah, it's a great question. There, I think, is research being done on different ways in which falsafa might have transformed or been carried on. I suspect that's not what he's talking about here. The falasifa, along with the Mu'tazila, along with the Qadariya, along with different early groups that were held to be heretical, kind of become, what's the right word? Groups that kind of like holding points for like, we're not this. Like, that's a heretical idea. We are the Ahl Sunnah. We believe this, we don't believe that. And you kind of have different groups that represent those that aren't necessarily reflective of the current reality at the moment, but are kind of holders, I guess, for those ideas. But you're right to ask. I mean, I think a key thing here is that the falasifa or falsafa came to represent a certain set of beliefs. So I think we have the idea today that we have a philosophy department and we have perhaps a theology department. These are different disciplines. What really happens with falsafa is that, I mean, everyone was doing logic. Everyone was kind of engaging in similar fashion with similar arguments. What became the problem with falsafa was that they had specific heretical beliefs. And this is what Ghazali was so upset about in his text. You know, it's like, you believe that the world is eternal. That's a huge, problem for us of the Ahl Sunnah. You have these other problematic beliefs. So, I mean, clearly Sanusi also here has the sense that there's maybe an excessive use of technical terms, but I find that a bit more difficult to deal with because he also is writing with technical terms in his longer writings. So my suspicion is more that, like other thinkers at the time, the problem with falsafa, the problem with the falasifa was that they became a heretical sect, right? It was less, oh, you're doing this discipline that we have a problem with, and it was more, you are a heretical group. In the same way that the Mu'tazila were, in the same way that other groups we might point to were.
I think this is strategy of Sanusi, because they absorb the methods of the philosophy in his writings, and they neglect them, and they refuse the philosophy. Also, Ibn Khaldun did it. Ibn Khaldun in his Muqaddimah, and other scholars. I think it's more a strategy because of the socio-political environment in that time, and the huge maybe authority of the fuqaha in this time. So you have to to make some politics to also in his writing to also Ibn Taymiyyah in his books. I think in I don't remember شو he say بينما الإنسان مدني بطبعه. It's very Greek. It's very Hellenistic, and then in the same text he refused and يكفر the philosophy and the philosopher. So it's a little bit it's a little bit more strategy of this kind of scholars to to some kind of defense because of the political authority, because of the authority of the fuqaha, and so on.
What I think I'm slightly differently, but kind of in the same lines as that, right? I think it's a category or a translation mistake to say falsafa is philosophy, right? What I'm trying to point to here, and I think what you're kind of getting at, is falsafa sort of like became a bad word. Like no one wanted, no one would identify in these later centuries as like, I'm doing falsafa, but that did not mean that there wasn't logical, thoughtful engagement with ideas going on, right? So if we do this one-to-one translation of falsafa equals philosophy equals the philosophy of the 20th and 21st century, then right, you're going to look back and say, ooh, falsafa kind of disappeared from the scene in the 1100s, but you're going to be totally missing the point if you stick with that superficial level.
Simple question about the how much can we know about who gave him his bread? I mean, like, were there institutions or patronage? I mean, like, what kind of, like, how would someone like Ibn Sanusi be able to?
How do you support yourself as a scholar?
Yeah. Or what are the sort of structures, or do we have knowledge of these things?
Yeah, there's unfortunately not yet great material, but you can, if you read the primary sources, you can pick stuff up. So, right, it's not always explicitly laid out. Sanusi was really renowned as a Sufi saint. I kind of suspect, that's what he's remembered for today. When I visited Tlemcen a month or two ago, it's like, oh my gosh, there's so much barakah around his tomb, and that's what he's remembered for. I think it's an interesting kind of thing that happens in the course of the 20th century, is that this intellectual stuff kind of gets dropped out and people become, he's remembered as a saint and not less so as a thinker. I don't know a ton about this, but my guess is if you were kind of renowned as a spiritual figure in that way, that the local people would perhaps support you, and they would draw benefits from that. His rival in Tlemcen, a man named Ibn Zakri, was an orphan and started attending a madrasa near Tlemcen. And there's a story in his sort of scholarly resume or biography that it had snowed, and the madrasa that he attended was a little ways outside of town, and so rather than wanting to walk back in the snow, he hid in his sheikh's house, and his sheikh found him and was like, what are you doing here? And he's like, it's too cold to walk back. And so they went to the sultan, who then started giving Ibn Zakri a stipend, essentially, to live at the madrasa so he wouldn't have to go back and forth. And they list off some of the things that the stipend was for, and it's like, oh, for your olive oil and for your cooking implements and for a room at the madrasa. So there were some institutional structures in place to do that. Some scholars were really wary of getting involved with the institutional structures. There was definitely the idea that if you take a judge position, which would, help pay for your scholarly activities, you're going to become corrupt, right? You don't want to be supported by power in that way. So I think there's a variety of ways in which people would get by. It's a great question.
My question is, you might have said it and I might have missed it. Are the manuscripts you're finding and the commentaries and are contemporary of Sanusi or later, or they came later? Is this importance of Sanusi an Ottoman part of also an Ottoman reuse of these like saints, or maybe his sanctification part of like a later how you call it, like using a figure as a theological authority, or
That's a great question. The commentaries on his writings began quite quickly. So one of his main students and the guy who writes this really flattering Menachem. Hi, Bunker Nara. Yeah, the commentaries began pretty quickly, but seemed to pick up pace, especially in the 17th century. And he does get picked up somewhat in Ottoman areas. I think he's more influential in North Africa and Malaysia, like I said, kind of Islamic Africa. But he definitely turns up and gets cited as a theological authority. Al-Imam Sanusi, call Al-Imam Sanusi such and such, kida kida.
So back to what you said before, why do you think that Sanusi did fall out of influence, and why do you think we see in the 20th century the shift towards, the shift away from looking at perhaps Islamic intellectual history and this pronounced interest in religious tradition or religious, whatever exactly the lens is that you're identifying?
The second part I know a little less about. Regarding these shifts that happen in the 20th century, there's starting to be more scholarship done on this, and I think we need a lot more still. But so what you see is that when colonial administrators show up to North Africa in the late 19th century, so late 1800s, early 1900s, they show up and they're like, oh, Sanusi is this major guy. If we want to write about what's going on here, this is who we should write about. And so you have a number of articles about him. There's some translations of the Short Creed. Also, when the printing press comes to the region, to Egypt, and to other parts of North Africa, Sanusi's writings are being printed, and then all of a sudden they just kind of disappear. And there's no scholarship on him, as far as I can tell, until a dissertation written in the 1970s, and then kind of nothing else until the last year or two, more or less. I mean, I don't want to make too broad of a generalization, but there's definitely something happening there in the 20th century. And it seems like what it is a combination of efforts by, or assumptions by, Orientalists, colonial administrators, and also local reformers like Muhammad Abdu, who benefit, or in the case of colonial administrators, perhaps, like benefit from and also have racist assumptions about there having been a decline, an intellectual decline. And for the reformers, a need to reform, if you need to reform something, there needs to have been a problem. There needs to have been a decline. And then when you also get the rise of Salafi movements, and they look back and they're telling their own narrative, they're interested in people like Ibn Taymiyyah, who I think at the time was really kind of out there on his own intellectually in his own moment. You know, it seemed like he was not part of the mainstream. So you really get this kind of revision of Islamic intellectual history, and like I said at the beginning, this playing up of the golden age. There was this flourishing period of falsafa, of rationalism, and then this decline that happens, and people who belong to the supposed decline era, like Sanusi, just get dropped out because there wasn't anything of interest happening. And you still find this, there's some overviews of Asherism, for example, in the Islamic West written in Arabic, and they mark the decline from Sanusi onward. They're like, oh, everyone just kind of started writing in the style of Sanusi. Everyone was just imitating. There wasn't anything new going on. So there's kind of different versions of the decline narrative, but it's very much still with us. And I really think it has to do with the politics of the 20th century. And I would love to see more scholarship done on that to bring the specific contours of that to light.
Just a small related question. Do you see in the original text any type of indication that these people see themselves or see those in their more recent past, so 15th, 16th, 17th, even 18th century, as participating in some type of decline? Or do we really only see this idea, or is this kind of a recurring theme where people are saying, oh, all the people that came before me were quite dumb, but now I'm doing something great?
No, so what makes this complicated is that Sanusi actually is very pessimistic about his time period. He's like, it's so hard to find a great teacher these days. You're so lucky if you can find someone, kind of pointing at himself. But I think this is really part of a trope of Fised de Zemin, right? You just have a different sense of things when you think the prophet Muhammad was the model, the height, and then you have the Salaf who was this perfect generation, and then everything since then has kind of been on the downhill. So for Sanusi, there's a sense of the further away we get from the time of the prophet, kind of the more trouble we're in. But that's very different from we're experiencing a cultural, it's different from the sort of decline narrative that we have now. And also, not everyone shared that grim picture that Sanusi had. So other people, and even he says, in his short creed, he's like, I'm going to have this section at the end of this text that no one has ever done before. It's like this great section. Everyone's going to benefit from it. It's going to, it's going to be wonderful. So even with him, with his pessimism and kind of grumbling around how miserable the intellectual scene was in his day, even he will frame himself as putting forward something new and of benefit to people. And other scholars are even kind of more upfront about doing that sort of thing. This is so great.
Can you see from his writings that he's aware of what was happening in the East?
That's a great question. He knows and cites people like Teftazani, who wrote, a century before him. Maybe more contemporary people also. Yeah, maybe less so with his works. That's something maybe for me to think about. But other scholars, for sure. Especially with people going on pilgrimage on the Hajj to from. There was a lot of scholarly conversations, and Cairo especially was this huge hub and meeting point. So yeah, I think there was really like a pretty wide awareness of what was happening in different regions, and you'd kind of be like, oh, like, we know about this scholar or this book, I want to go be able to study with him, or let's get his book back here, let's make copies of it. So there was, I think, a lot of circulation of scholars and texts and ideas. But yeah, I don't know about him in particular, and kind of a homebody in Tlemcen, staying put. Great.
Thank you so much.
Thank you guys so much for all the wonderful questions. Really appreciate it.